Hi, everyone. It's Eileen Minogue. I'm the executive director for the book Fairies. Welcome. It's Tuesday, and again, we are halfway through our readathon. We are grateful to everyone who has participated so far, and it's not too late to get involved. If you would like to create a personal fundraising page, you can do that through the link on our Facebook or on our website. If you do not want to create a personal Facebook page, you can also donate at any time. No amount is too small. Today, I am excited to introduce you to Margaret Ables and Amy Wilson. They are the co-hosts of the comedy parenting podcast, What Fresh Hell, Laughing in the Face of Motherhood, a top 10 parenting podcast in Apple Podcasts with over 2 million downloads to date. That is huge. You guys are famous.
I mean, on a curve, for sure.
Between them, Margaret and Amy have 6 kids, ages 7 to 17, another impressive feat as far as I'm concerned.
That's right.
What Fresh Hell was the winner of the 2018 Mom 2.0 Iris Award for Best Podcast, the 2017 Podcast Awards People's Choice for the Best Family and Parenting Podcast, and a finalist for the 2019 Romper's Parents' Choice Award. That's all amazing credits to you both.
Great, sorry.
Margaret Ables is a comedy writer and producer with a wide array of credits in television, film, and theater, including head of video and senior writer at Nickelodeon's NickMom. Amy is the author of the parenting memoir, When Did I Get Like This? Harper Collins, and the creator of Motherhood, a one-woman show which toured to 16 nationwide cities after its hit off-Broadway run. Amazing. We're so excited to have you guys here today. And from what I understand, you're going to be reading Sideways Tales from Wayside School by Louis Sachar. Is that correct?
That's right. I picked this story because in my days as an actor, the Screen Actors Guild has a program where you can go into New York City schools that don't have as much enrichment program as some other schools maybe. And so they would have actors go in and read to them to get them lit up about reading. And, you know, it can be a tough crowd, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, right? They're like, who's this lady? I mean, they're glad to not be, you know, doing worksheets for half an hour, but what is this? And so this was the book that I would bring that would just, there's something about this book that is a line drive over the plate for like first, second, third grade. I just love it.
Love it. I'm gonna remove myself and let you guys do what you do best.
Thank you. Just to be clear, I'm the one who's Margaret.
Yeah, and I'm Amy.
We have we'll talk for 20 minutes. People are like, which one is which? I didn't get it. So, Amy, why don't you start us off with the introduction, and then we'll read chapter 1.
Okay.
I'll tag you in on chapter 1.
Sideways Tales from Wayside School by Louis Sachar. Introduction. This book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them, there is something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to be only 1 story high with 30 classrooms all in a row. Instead, it is 30 stories high with 1 classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. The children at Wayside like having a sideways school. They have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th story of Wayside School. It has been said that these stories are strange and silly. That is probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly. That is probably also true.
Chapter 1, Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. If you children are bad, she warned, or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples. Mrs. Gorf did not like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count. But he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught them how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. Hey, that isn't fair, said Todd. John was only trying to help a friend. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. Does anyone else have an opinion? She asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. I do not allow crying in the classroom, said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet. And when they went home, they were too scared to even talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on her desk. They were about to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, God bless you, when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Amy, why don't you take over from there?
Terrence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Mauricia opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue. Mauricia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The 3 boys named Eric laughed. They were turned into apples. Now Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrence, Mauricia, and the 3 Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Lewis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples. He walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Lewis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all of the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home, she said. I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again. You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. Stop, she shouted, or I'll turn you into applesauce. But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children, Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, this time her left one first, then her right, and turned the apples back into children. All right, Mauricia said. Let's go get Lewis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Mrs. Gorf. I'll turn you back into apples. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, and stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple, but none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Lewis, the yard teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf? He asked. Nobody said a word. Boy, am I hungry, said Lewis. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many. He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it up on his shirt, and ate it.
Reading this, I read this to my kids to prepare, and my daughter was like, well, that took a dark turn. She's not wrong. Takes a little bit of a dark turn there.
It starts dark, right, with Mrs. Jewell. Like, yeah, it just oh my gosh, it's got these like slapstick elements in it where like Joe can't count. Chapter 3 is about Joe who can't count, but he always gets to the right answer. And the teacher is trying to get him to count, to understand that you have to count in order. You can't go like 1, 7, 14, 6. But if he counts wrong, he'll go 1, 7, 14, 6, 5. But if he counts right, he somehow gets it wrong. And it's just like, if you're 8 years old watching these teachers trying their best and being like outdone by silly children, it's just, you know, it's just the sweet spot. And I love making anybody laugh, whether it's kids or adults. And I just think this book is so funny and hilarious.
Another thing that brought us to this book is that obviously, so we have a parenting podcast where we talk to moms, mostly some dads too, but a lot of moms. And so the thing on everyone's mind now is back to school, right? And back to school, we have this feeling that it's going to go a bit sideways. And so that is what we've been talking about quite a bit on our podcast. So if you don't know our podcast, it is called What Fresh Hell, Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. It's a comedy parenting podcast. And I know someone had a question, where did you come up with the name for your podcast? Amy, why don't you take that one away?
Well, you know, it's funny because Margaret and I have known each other for a long time. We started working on the podcast.
Our nickname for ourselves on the podcast is the Oldie Locks.
Yes.
We're,
yes.
you know, older moms.
That's us. Well, yeah, we've just been doing this for a while, let's just say. We've been doing this for a while. We like Duran, like we have firsthand experience of that. We appreciated them unironically, right? So you came to me like 4 years ago and said like, let's do a podcast together. Let's try this. And Margaret's a really fun person. So I said, sure. And you actually had the title like fully formed and ready to go. Dorothy Parker, who was a humorist from the Algonquin Round Table, gosh, that's like 80 years ago now. She was just a wry, like martini in her hand, you know, right? Like wit of the time. And she used to answer her telephone or her door and say, what fresh hell is this? As like it's sort of now what, but in a much wittier way. And you heard it from your mom, is that right?
Mom adopted this to herself. My mom had been like a career professional person and then got married in her 30s and had 3 kids and went from like, she always said, went from an office where like she snapped her fingers and 10 people like ran to meet her needs to being at home with 3 little kids who she couldn't even get to like stop hitting each other with frying pans. And she just felt like every day she would just open every door and be like, what fresh hell is awaiting me behind this door? Like, what is going to come to me today? And to her, that kind of summed up the experience of being a mom. And it's always resonated with me and that's kind of what we get at in the podcast, I think, is just kind of the daily, it's never what you expect. Sometimes the fresh hell is amusing, fun, wonderful. Often the fresh hell is terrifying, terrible.
Pandemic.
And so that's kind of how we roll on the podcast. Another question, how did you two meet? Did we mention it was a long time ago?
A long time ago. We were both in comedy groups in college at different colleges, but I went to Yale and Margaret's sister was in my comedy group, and we used to go to Columbia/Barnard and do improv shows with Margaret's comedy group, and that's how we met. And then both of us were in the television world as writers, as performers. Then we became parents. We took that off ramp. We were both home with 3 little kids. Started creating funny content around parenting. Still not together. We just were having a sort of parallel journey in this
parallel
way.
play, as they say.
Yes, right. So we were like 2-year-olds playing nicely with their trucks next to each other. And then it finally came together in this podcast about 4 years ago.
Again, years and years later. And so, yeah, it was very fortuitous.
Somebody asks here, you were both writers. What inspires you to come up with the topics for your stories, whether it be a book or for a show? So, I mean, like, the topics are the easy part, right? If you had asked me, we're almost 200 episodes into this podcast now. If you had asked me what would be hard, like, well, how do you come up with things to talk about? It turns out that is the easiest thing, that we keep a running spreadsheet, and it goes far ahead of weeks we had to do things. And sometimes our listeners give us, we read out every email, every message our listeners send us, and they often will come up with really, really good suggestions. But I think what the comedian brings to it, like, no matter how intense things get as a parent, if you're a comedian, there's always one little part of you that's like, oh, this is going to be a good story later, right? Like, this is hilarious. I'm running from a swarm of bees. This is going to be a great story later. And something about that is, it keeps me going. And now that I know I have like people to talk to about it, and Margaret in particular, it helps me keep a sense of humor. It helps me keep sane no matter what goes down.
And I mean, I was in comedy and a writer for years and years before I had kids, and working on a parenting podcast is like, I mean, I had more of this problem when I was just trying to come up with generically funny things. And now it just feels like we're in like a river of every day it's something. Amy has an expression, there's always a thing, there's always a thing and a thing. And that is the truth of our podcast. Like, we never are short on material. We have, as we mentioned, 6 kids. They're now, we have to update our bio. They're 8 to, is your
8 to 17. Yeah, 8 to 17.
Because my 7-year-old turned 8. So we have 8 to 17. And I mean, it's endless. I mean, they're always coming up with more nonsense for us to goof on.
The next question is, do you ever have polar opposite opinions? You seem to really balance each other out.
That's kind of that's kind of what made us start doing this to begin with. So as we said, we were kind of running on these parallel tracks. I would turn on the TV. Oh, there's Amy Wilson. I remember her. And I was at Nickelodeon, and I literally was working on video content for them. And she came across my desk, like one of the videos she was in. I was like, oh, that's that Amy Wilson again. But as we started talking about putting this podcast together, it became pretty clear that, much to our blessing, we have extremely opposite parenting styles. So I think that if we just had a conversation every week where it was like, who cares? Let him be. It'll all work out. And Amy said, yeah, that's a great idea. It wouldn't be that interesting.
Very short episodes.
We are congenitally, like, I am pretty laissez-faire, kind of over it, kind of like, they'll be fine. Who needs a book? This isn't interesting. Well, it'll all work out. And Amy is like, never met a book she didn't like. We'll figure it out by making a graph and a chart. And I think that really helps, because then people who listen to us often feel like, oh, I'm the Amy or I'm the Margaret. And so that I think sometimes when people listen to like, here's a book and here's a chart and you can figure it out. If you're like me, you listen to that and you're like, what am I going to get a new head and become a completely new person? That's not gonna work. But the good news in listening to us, I think, is you can hear both perspectives. And I mean, spoiler alert, the answer is almost always somewhere in the middle, right?
Right. We move towards the middle, like, oh, maybe it's this. And we've talked about this a lot over the years, that our parenting outlooks and approaches have changed for the better from doing this podcast and from learning from each other. And I think we continue to surprise each other. We both prepare for episodes, but we don't prepare together for episodes. So we know we're going to talk about, should kids do chores, say. We each do our little preparation for that, and we sit down and talk about it, but I don't know what Margaret's going to say.
Nice. She prepares and researches and jump on the microphone and wing it. I don't really prepare.
But if I think I know what you're going to say, I am often wrong. Like,
yeah, and the nice thing, the unexpected real joy of doing this podcast for us has really been, I kind of was like, oh, we're both funny, we can talk about funny things, but it's become something much deeper than that. Like, it's helped me be a better parent. And there's a lot of things, I kind of came into it with the philosophy of like, anyone who prepares meal plans and keeps a clean house is a freak who's trying to show off for Pinterest. Like, it never even occurred to me that was a system that worked for some people. And that in fact, I could benefit from some of those systems myself. And that being constantly in this tornado of crazy wasn't just my fate, which I kind of thought it was. I had 3 kids in 4 years when I was in my late 30s. And I was kind of like, well, I guess I just kind of jumped on this roller coaster and I guess I'll go to Crazy Town. And it really has been such a great, fun experience to sort of sort out some of the issues around parenting to mine and hopefully my kids' betterment. I don't know if my kids would agree, but they're not on here. So I'll say
this is for them.
They don't get to weigh in.
Joanna wants to know, what's the strangest question we've ever gotten? I don't know if we've ever gotten a strange question, have we? We get tough ones.
We definitely get tough ones. We definitely get ones. I mean, I get some sometimes that I just can't relate to. Like, I'm worried that my kid is only doing 6 activities. Should they be doing 12? And I'm just like, what? I don't understand the language that you're speaking. Like my kids do 2 and it's way too much for me. So I think, I don't know that we've ever gotten like a really loony question, but I've definitely gotten questions where I'm just like, I gotta let Amy handle this one because I don't relate to this. We do so we do a regular podcast on Wednesdays. That's our like big 45-minute discussion of the weekly topic. And then we take questions on Mondays. We do a short, like 5-minute, here's my quick take on your question. And those are funny how they break down. I'll get one and I'm like, oh, that's an Amy question. I get nothing to say to like this person who wants to do more reading about breastfeeding. Like that is not for me.
Right. And then sometimes there's questions that's like, oh, I know that she'll have something funny to say about that. Right. So we can, between the two of us, there's usually somebody who has something good to add.
Yeah.
Somebody was asking us about taking our show on the road. So we do live shows because that's like,
Used to.
that's our sweet spot. Yeah. We love to perform, and it's just like the highest form of like to go out and do a live show with a room full of usually almost all moms who have gotten a babysitter. They're out with their friends.
Every once in a while, a poor dad wanders in and what did my wife bring me to? This is
mock them.
They usually have fun. We goof on them because
you might bring them on stage.
You took a wrong turn. This is a mom night out, and then there's some poor dad like sitting next to his wife, like, I'm afraid of this. But we do 90 minutes. It's games. It's comedy. It's such a fun night out, and it has been. I mean, besides being stuck at home with our children and husbands, it's been a real big downside of the pandemic. There have been several really big downsides of the pandemic. Not going good, guys.
Connor wants to know, should kids do chores?
Put your child on the chat.
Yeah, I don't think he's on Facebook, so he's really just
that would really
bold right now.
Child came onto the chat to be like, do I have to do chores? That would be so deeply passive aggressive. I believe that children should do chores. Yes.
I believe that children should do chores, but this is the sweet spot of our podcast. Like, we'll talk about this. Our plans on this can change. You might come back 3 weeks later, like, oh guys, remember how I said I had a chore chart? Like, we totally already forgot about it. Like we're in it. We're deeply engaging with it and working on it, but we don't always have the perfect answer. And
this is another like crazy question one too. I feel like chores, my basic position, spoiler for the entire podcast, is relax already. Like, you're doing it. It's fine. And I think that chores is one of these things that becomes like, my children should be getting up in the morning. I just watched Little House on the Prairie, and why aren't they like scrubbing the floors and getting up and tilling the earth and doing 8 million things a day? And instead, all they do is watch screens. And I just think chores is the kind of thing we right now during the pandemic everyone has one chore. So like, one of my kids waters all the plants. One of my kids changes the laundry over, and one of my kids sets the table. Those are the 3 chores. And so they know they have to do those things every day, but during the day, there's also a lot of clean up the mess you made and do this. You know, I'm not for like, I've done this myself, invented some like hugely complicated chore chart, financial reward system thing, and it always falls apart after a week because who can keep track of all of that?
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, it's your turn to water the lawn, it's your turn to do the dishes, whatever.
And for my kids are older, and I think the pandemic it's been a larger conversation around, I don't want you to think like you have to bring all the towels downstairs and then you're good till tomorrow, right? We all live in a house. The kitchen's always a mess. Like, pick up a spoon. Let's go. Let's all contribute as we walk by. What could I be doing to help? So
we've been kind of big on like lean into the learning during the pandemic in terms of we all have to now exist in this space 24 hours a day, you know, and how is that going to look? If you guys make a huge fort in the living room and you don't clean it up, my head explodes. It doesn't work great. So let's work on who does what and like kind of figure out what this picture looks like. That's been another slight.
We're working on it.
Upset.
We have a question here. What's the most controversial topic you've discussed? I would say it's been this, some of the larger questions around COVID. Like, we had an episode based on downloads. This was a question that everybody is struggling with. How are we going to do this when everyone's doing it differently? And it was an episode about like when your brother-in-law is, you know, putting up pictures on Facebook that he's having people over and you're supposed to see them next weekend and you don't really feel good about that. Like, how do you have that conversation? And again, we come to this, like, we ask the questions that we're interested in learning more about. We don't come to it like, here is the answer. And so I think the question around that and our other recent episode on, are we comfortable sending our kids back to school? Which of course is a very individualized question, but what are the factors that should even be considered? I think those are ones where we're trying to be very careful to be helpful and not judgmental.
And that's always the balance when you're dealing with people. And I like the way you said that, Amy. It's like, we don't present ourselves as experts. We're moms having a conversation that other moms are listening to, and we're trying to figure it out for ourselves. And so, I mean, we have things that we believe, but there's very few things that we present as like, this is absolutely wrong to do as a parent. Very few. I also think in-laws was controversial. People were like, I don't want to say things about my kids. I'm like, I don't want you to tell me I have to be nice to them.
Yeah. Yep.
Hi guys, you guys are doing a fantastic job. I wanted to hop in because I actually had a question for you.
Okay.
I was listening to one of your podcasts and you were talking about going back to school, and I wanted to, I love what you said because you tried to be completely understanding and appreciative for the teachers and the schools and the hard situation that they're in, but also understanding that every parent has a very unique situation. And I wanted to, if you guys could just talk a little bit about what you were talking about on that podcast, because I found it refreshing, because I think it made me realize that everybody, I think you even mentioned it, Margaret, you know, if you've met a child that's autistic, you've met one autistic child, it's very much the same thing. And if you guys could just talk a little bit about what you were doing that, because we work with a lot of families that don't have a choice. You know, they are the essential workers. They are the ones, some people have the luxury of saying, I'm going to stay home, I'm going to take care of my kids. Other people don't have that. And I think you really brought that to full circle and recognition that it is difficult. It's a difficult decision for the people that are making that decision in the institutions and for the individual parents. So I'll let you talk about what you were saying at that podcast, because I thought it was amazing.
Thank you. It's interesting. So the point is, there's an expression in the autism community. If you've met one child with autism, you've met one child with autism, saying that like, this is a spectrum disorder where every kid is affected so differently that it's difficult to, you know, apply lessons from dealing with one kid to other kids. And I think it's kind of a useful metaphor for this situation, because that's exactly it. And even after that episode, we've gotten feedback like, because I'm kind of like, you know what, guys, please don't stress about the learning this year. That's not interesting to me. Everyone's in the same boat. Kids we're going to have to figure this out next year. How we catch everybody up. What did it mean for ACTs? What did it mean for SATs? How are college admissions people looking at this? And I have gotten some pushback where people are like, nope, that's not true for my kid. My kid has worked really hard. I don't want them to lose their whole junior year. That's not fair. You have little kids, which is true. My oldest is going into 7th grade. So I can kind of take this year I could definitely take it as a wash for my 3rd grader. And even my 7th grader, who really cares? Like, what does he learn? You know, we'll read some books, it'll be fine. And so the pushback has been a little bit like, wait a minute, juniors and seniors in high school aren't in that easy situation that you're talking about. And I do have to recognize, like, you're right, I'm not really in that world. And so I guess it is different if you have a junior and senior, but I just come back to the thing of, it really becomes an exercise in accepting the things you can't control, you know, because I just think at the end of the day, it's not fun advice, but what other advice is there than you have to make the best of the situation that you are in. And I can't really give you advice on how to deal with your junior and the ACTs. I'm not in that situation. And also half the people listening to that aren't in that situation, because as you said, they're going to do a pod in their backyard where a tutor comes and helps 5 kids. Some people can't afford that. Some people live in Maine where it's already getting cold. I mean, it is almost impossible to talk about going back to school in broad strokes, which is difficult and complicated. So we try to say, here's what we're doing, here's our perspective, and hopefully that helps some people.
Yeah, I think we've hit in this current situation sort of the limits. There are some situations that we can't offer one size fits all advice, and we can't even offer advice at all in certain things. And sometimes I think our listeners come to our show and our Facebook group and all the places that you can find What Fresh Hell for advice and laughter, but also like just community, just to feel validated and to feel seen. And so I think sometimes we feel frustrated when we can't offer, well, this will work, let's do it this way, right? So I think we are all in this pandemic moment hitting the limits of that, but we can at least show up for each other as moms and say, that sounds really hard because
it stinks, and it stinks for us, and it probably stinks even more for a lot of other people.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's it. It's just that we're all in the same boat, but our boats are different sizes, different shapes. You know, it's just different.
Some of them are taking on water.
Yes, some of them are really, some of them are underwater. And I think that at the end of the day, that's it, is everybody's individual, and we can't put one person into another person's shoes, and especially for those we serve, because they're the ones that are really, they don't have the resources that that some have at home. We've had teachers come to us and say, I'm giving reading assignments, and the kids in my class, they don't have books at home. So every situation is different, and we're trying to shine a light on the fact that the kids that we serve, they're really in jeopardy. They don't have the parents at home because they are the essential workers. And this is really, it's a traumatic time for everybody, but we're hoping that one little bright light is that if we can get books in the hands of these kids, then even helping them to learn, but also to take them away from the situations that they're in, because a book is a magical thing to have. So,
and what a lesson for kids right now. Like, what more important lesson is your kid learning than, like, in hard times, we try to be of service to other people. We try to look how we're surviving this, however difficult this is. Let's imagine how difficult it is for other people and see if we can be of service to them. Like, you're never going to convince me that's less important than getting a high score on the ACT.
Mm.
Well, that's true. That is true. So we are very grateful for the both of you. Your podcast is really, it does take you away. You do have a way of making something that could be serious into a little bit lighthearted and making it more palpable. And for that, we thank you, especially during these crazy, crazy times. And thank you
so much for everything you guys are doing.
Listen, you're helping us to raise awareness and bring it to a different crowd, perhaps, and get more books in the hands of kids. And that, at the end of the day, is what it's all about, because it changes the trajectory for their life. And that's the most important thing. So thank you both. We hope that you'll come back next year, and we appreciate all of your time.
Thanks, Eileen.
Thanks so much.
So long.
Thank you.